Hello, it's Garrison Keillor, and I'm sitting in an apartment on West 90th Street in New York City, where I've been along with my wife and daughter for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, unbelievable, sitting out this pandemic, doing it as a matter of civic duty, but it turns out to be interesting and mysterious. And because it is, I want to talk with a couple of poets who are doing the same. We need to turn to poets when life is mysterious. They spend time thinking about this, as do we, but the rest of us are rushing around, and we hope they are not. My guests are Barbara Crooker, who comes from upstate New York, up in Cold Spring, lives now out in northeastern Pennsylvania. I believe that we have used 50 of your poems on the Writer's Almanac.
It's getting
Is
closer
that
to
true?
60. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, thank you.
So you are a very, very wealthy woman, and I'm glad you've been published everywhere. And I believe you have a book coming out called Nasty Women, an unapologetic anthology of subversive verse. Is this true? Or did I make that up?
You did not make it up, but it came out last year. It's an anthology, so I have one poem in it.
Oh, you do? I see. All right. All right. Well, I hope you'll feel free to be subversive here in our conversation, where you're joined by Jeff Coomer, who is one of the few corporate executives to ever make his way into the world of poetry. He was a CIO, which used to stand for Congress of Industrial Organizations, but in his world it stands for Corporate Information Officer. I have no idea what a CIO does. Must have something to do with computers, yes?
It did. I was in charge of all of the computer networks for the worldwide division, largest division of Black & Decker for most of my career.
And how long ago did you retire? And how much of what you knew about computers have you managed to forget?
I have managed to forget most of it, and I actually knew very little to begin with. So it wasn't a huge loss. I did retire very early, though. I kind of stumbled into the corporate world and IT. I had a degree in political science from a small liberal arts college here in Maryland. Somehow I parlayed that into this life as a corporate executive. But most of my job was really more understanding the business and the business processes, and then helping with that to figure out how to make the right investments in technology. I tell people, though, that I'm a CIO, and everybody thinks I can fix their PC. I'm not your guy.
So the world of computers has changed so rapidly that now, in a short period of time, you've become obsolete.
Yes, that's true. Right. I would not recognize, no corporation should in good conscience hire me for anything to do with IT, because in the 15 years almost since I've been retired, I would be taking them back 2 generations.
So, Barbara, how have you been keeping yourself sane and happy during this pandemic?
Well, I've actually been in quarantine since November because my husband fell and broke his leg then. So going out has been difficult since November.
Yes, really? Really? So what are you doing? But you've gone outdoors. I mean, you're out living out in the country, right?
Sure. And he got his cast or his boot off 2 days before the governor shut our state down. So the timing wasn't very good.
I see.
Yeah, but I'm writing, I'm gardening, I'm cooking.
What kind of gardening, Barbara?
I have a lot of perennials. We have a small orchard. I have an herb garden, and I am attempting to have a vegetable garden, but we have another frost warning tonight. We had snow last Saturday. So nature is making it a little more difficult.
Mm-hmm. What kind of vegetables are your favorites to raise?
Oh my, tomatoes. If I can have only one thing, it would be tomatoes.
Yes, I agree with you. Something has happened genetically to the tomato since I grew up in a house with a big garden, and something has happened. Store-bought tomatoes are bred for durability, are they not?
Exactly. Long shelf life. Well, a good tomato should have a short shelf life.
So what can we do about this?
Buy heirloom seeds, the seeds of the older plants.
So the plants that my parents raised were heirloom tomatoes, though we did not use that term.
Right, exactly.
So Jeff, a poem of yours that I remember, before we get around to your pandemic poem, the poem of yours that I remember is a poem called, what was it called? It's called History Lesson, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Was that, I know you may not like the question, but that's from real life. It sure has a feeling that it comes from real life, does it not?
It is from real life. Absolutely.
May I read it?
Of course.
My grandfather left school at 14 to work odd jobs until he was old enough to join his Lithuanian kin, chipping anthracite out of the Pennsylvania hills. 9 hours a day with 500 feet of rock over his head, then an hour's ride home on the company bus to a dinner of boiled cabbage and chicken. When the second big war broke, he headed south, as he pronounced it, for better work in the blast furnaces, churning out steel along the shores of the Chesapeake. 32 years and half an index finger later, he retired to a brick rancher he built with his own hands just outside the Baltimore city line. The spring he got cancer, and I got a BA from a private college. We stood under a tree in his backyard while he copped a smoke out of my grandmother's sight. Tell me, Pop, I said, wanting to strike up a conversation, how did you like working in the mills all those years? He studied my neatly pressed white shirt, took a long drag on his cigarette, and spit a fleck of tobacco near my shoes. Like, he said, didn't have a thing to do with it. That's such a beautiful poem.
Thank you.
Such a gorgeous poem. It just reads itself. And what it tells me, in addition to all the clues it gives about your background and telling this story, is the beauty of the simple declarative sentence. All wonderful writing, he said to the poet on his screen, begins with a simple declarative sentence. We thought otherwise when I was in college. We believed in tumultuous, twisting sentences. We tried to write like Federico Garcia Lorca, but to write the declarative sentence is where you need to begin. Don't you think?
Well, it's funny. I'm not sure. I do, and I love poetry. I've been reading it my whole life, lots of styles, and I love many poets. But, personally, I'm not sure from my background I'm capable of more than what you just described. I think it comes from, I didn't study literature or poetry in any kind of formal way. My business career was very sort of pragmatic and practical, oriented in that kind of results way that corporations are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just the nature of my personality. People don't know me but are getting to know me will often say, were you an accountant or a financial analyst in your business life? And I guess I exude that, and that's not something I.
Mm-hmm. Well, you make eye contact, Jeff. I mean, that means that you work with people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I've always had a hard time making eye contact, and it makes me look furtive. So I would never qualify to sell anything to anybody or try to persuade executives of anything. So I was driven into a career in radio simply by this shyness, or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
You had a good time in your career?
I did. I enjoyed it very much. But, I also, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm somebody who I actually never had a clear idea of what I wanted to do with my life. I kind of view myself as the poster child of the liberal arts education. I took a lot of courses in a lot of different things. I loved reading and learning how to think and applying knowledge and so on, but I never had that directed towards any particular career interest. And I think in my business career, most of the skills that I used were the people skills, the skills that you're sort of describing as, in some ways, of you lacking. That was how you were successful in the business world. It was all about understanding organizational dynamics and what the right leverage points were in order to sort of convince people to do the things that you needed them to do. And I didn't need to have a degree in computer science to do that in IT. I needed the kind of people skills that you get by reading poetry and history and philosophy and sitting around and talking about stuff like that and what people's motivations are, what their intentions are, and so on. And of course, you get a lot of that from great literature. That's what that's all about.
Try to convince me of something now, Jeff. Try to convince me of something. I'm going to ask you to convince me to sit down and write serious poetry.
Garrison, I hate to say this, but you actually picked the wrong thing for me to convince you of, because I don't believe in that.
You don't.
And I think having some level of belief in what you're trying to convince somebody of is important. I'm a big believer that poetry needs a little more lightness and humor. I think in the bio that I sent to Catherine, I mentioned that 3 of my favorite poets from the Writer's Almanac are George Bilgier, Louis Jenkins, and who was my third? I can't remember. Anyway. Oh, Billy Collins.
Billy Collins.
Yeah. So, I feel, that there's a role for the ponderous and the lofty in poetry, of course, but, I think most ordinary people want to approach it from the full spectrum of human emotion, which includes humor and, a lightness of delight that, is often missing from so much of the poetry that I read, even now. It's sort of like poets often seem to like to revel in pain and the ponderous revelation of pain, in my view. So back to your task, I'm ill-equipped to do it. I'm convincing you that poetry needs more humor.
Barbara, you go along with this, that poets revel in pain?
Well, I think, yes, I think he's speaking truth to power there. And, I tend to be a more serious writer, but the last poem I wrote, which is featured on Light magazine as Poem of the Week, has to do with murder hornets. It's not very serious at all.
The poem of yours that I really, that when I think back on your poems, becomes comes to mind right away is a poem with a great title, Ordinary Life. May I have your permission to read it?
Absolutely. And, you know, it actually would segue into what my job has been in life, which hasn't been a paid job. I've been the caregiver for my son who has autism. And although that poem doesn't seem to be a poem about autism, it actually really is. Go for it.
This was a day when nothing happened. The children went off to school, remembering their books, lunches, gloves. All morning, the baby and I built block stacks in the squares of light on the floor, and lunch blended into nap time. I cleaned out kitchen cupboards, one of those jobs that never gets done, then sat in a circle of sunlight and drank ginger tea, watched the birds at the feeder jostle over lunch's little scraps. A pheasant strutted from the hedgerow, preened and flashed his jeweled head. Now a chicken roasts in the pan, and the children return, the murmur of their stories dappling the air. I peel carrots and potatoes without paring my thumb. We listen together for your wheels up the drive. Grace before bread, and at the table, actual conversation, no bickering or pokes. And then the drift into homework. The baby goes to his cars, drives them along the sofas, ridges and hills. Leaning by the counter, we steal a long, slow kiss, tasting of coffee and cream. The chickens diminish to skin and skeleton, the moon to a comma, a sliver of white. But this has been a day of grace in the dead of winter, the hard, cold knuckle of the year, a day that unwrapped itself like an unexpected gift, and the stars turn on, order themselves into the winter night. A poem, Ordinary Life by Barbara Crooker. Barbara, you think back to writing that poem. How did the writing go for you? Was it easy? Was it a long struggle? Did you edit?
I always edit, and it's never easy.
Mm-hmm.
The trick for me, maybe for anyone, is to try to make it seem as if it's easy when you read it, but it's never easy.
Mm-hmm.
I often have had my writing students try to write like Billy Collins, use one of his poems as an example, and they see how difficult it is to try to write and make it seem like it's easy.
All right. Let's get on to the subject of the pandemic. Jeff, how are you doing in the pandemic? You're in Baltimore?
I'm in a little town on the eastern shore of Maryland, a small college town. It's actually the town that's the college that I graduated from. It's a small colonial town right on the Chester River, which feeds out into the Chesapeake Bay. Beautiful place and an easy place to spend time.
So these college kids are walking by your house. What do you have? Are you tempted to give them advice?
I'm not. Yes, I am tempted to give them advice, but they would run in the other direction. So that doesn't really seem to matter what I want in that regard. You know, the pandemic hasn't been so hard for me because I was pretty much a slacker before it started. So I'm just really going one slacker level up from that in what I'm doing. I read, I write, I get outside and exercise every day. It's the kind of town where you know, you can walk down lovely colonial streets with just beautiful, you know, 1700s era buildings and meet neighbors out on their porches. So even in the pandemic, there's a fair amount of socializing that we've been able to do just by virtue of going out for an evening walk, my wife and I. And we'll be talking from a distance of 20 feet with neighbors and friends doing the same thing. So from that standpoint, it's certainly not been the hardship that it's been for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. You're looking at a man right now, Jeff, who, though you can't see it, I'm wearing pajama bottoms, and I am barefoot, and I have been sleeping, I think, 10 hours a day, sometimes more. Is this your experience too? Or it sounds like you're leading a normal, busy, productive, interesting life.
Well, I wouldn't call it busy by anybody's stretch of the imagination. It's a life of private indulgence. I read, I write. Those are indulgences and luxuries that most people don't have, the means to do. I've always liked being outside, so taking daily walks or bicycling is a good thing to do, and I enjoy that. So it's again, I have nothing to complain about, and so on. Although I will say, one of my friends, when I said we were going to be doing this Zoom, asked me a question: is he wearing socks? I said, I'm going to have to ask, but I think you've already declared. So thank you for that.
Speaking of writing, if you would be so good as to read us your pandemic poem, Quarantining with the Dead.
Okay, so that's the poem, Quarantining with the Dead. They've been visiting under cover of darkness in flagrant disregard of the latest stay-at-home order. First my parents and grandparents, then the friends I fell out of touch with over the years, and last night, 2 teachers and a coworker I didn't appreciate when I had the chance. I'm embarrassed by how long it's been since I've thought about most of them, though they don't seem to mind. Eternity is a great teacher of patience and grace. Fortunately, their antibodies allow them to sit close enough for me to make out their voices, which are now thin as the music I sometimes hear from cars idling on the next street. No one bothers with masks. At times, I think I feel a comforting arm around my shoulder, but in the darkness, I can't be sure. After so long, even a touch as light as that is enough.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of something my mother said to me when she was 96, Jeff. She said, there's so much I would still like to know, but there's nobody left to ask.
Oh, that's a great line.
It is a great line.
Feel free to use it.
Thank you. All right, I have your permission.
I'm now at that age when I think about the dead, but not in the same way that I've thought about them, when I was young, when it just seemed like a tragedy, and one thought about one's own death. I don't think about that anymore. I think about what they know that I wish I knew. Who in particular do you wish you could talk to?
Well, I didn't grow up in a close family, and I really wish, as I've gotten older, that I had spent more time hearing the stories of my parents and grandparents. I am faced now with them long gone, and have every day I think of another question I would have loved to have asked them about their histories, what it was like for them growing up in the times that they had. And, we just didn't have the kind of family where those were the types of discussions that we held. So, but, it's sort of, in the absence of that, you really feel how much of your own history has gone with the deaths of other people. There's so much about you that you'll never know because you don't have the opportunity to see yourself through other people's eyes and to know how those eyes were formed, how their vision, kind of took hold of you. So that would probably be my biggest regret, or the biggest, or the people that I would most like to talk with more about.
You describe your family as taciturn?
Yes, I think that's fair, right. It was a very working class, kind of urban working class ethic. People didn't say a whole lot. The great sin of my neighborhoods was pretense, the thought that you might be or act in a way that made you appear to be better than somebody else, or you might, have that as an internal view of yourself was, just that, again, that was probably the sin of all sins, is everybody, thinking that you could be better than somebody. So, so that was sort of the ethic. And, so people didn't brag and people didn't BS. And so there wasn't just, it wasn't a storytelling kind of environment.
So might this taciturnity of your people that you grew up with be one motive for turning to writing poetry after you're safely retired?
Yes, I think it is, because in line with what I just mentioned, I've sort of appreciated that if you don't share your story or your perspective, it's lost. And certainly with the two children that my wife and I have, we do much more talking. We do engage much more in storytelling. I'm much more active in quizzing them about their lives and what's going on in their lives. But a lot of my poetry is, as is most people's, I guess, there's a strong autobiographical element in it. A history lesson is a prime example of that. So it is a way of telling my story, and in so doing, also, I try to reach back and hint at, in ways that I can, other people's stories as well, like my grandfather's in history lesson.
Barbara, I want to come to your pandemic poem here, because I was so shocked and pleased to see it. It's the first villanelle I've seen in years and years and years. I took a poetry writing class from Alan Tate in college, and he required us to write a sestina, sonnets, of course. He never required us to write a limerick, but he required.
But you don't need any instruction in that.
Well, actually, I think it's worth teaching.
Yeah. But you're so good at it.
The villanelle, it's a very strict form, and that means that very few people have taken it up. What in the world moved you to write a villanelle?
Well, I have written some other ones. I'm in an anthology that also came out last year called Love Affairs at the Villanelle. And it's an anthology of love villanelles. But I read somebody else's villanelle before I wrote this, and it occurred to me that the repetition and the constriction of the villanelle was very much like my life right now. We're doing the same things every day. We're asking each other what day it is because we don't know, because today is the same as 4 or 5 days ago. And so that repetitive nature just struck me as perfect for this subject.
It's a form of 5 3-line stanzas, and the last lines, though they may be modified, vary a little bit. They basically, the last lines repeat alternatively, and then in the last stanza, a 4-line stanza, those 2 lines then become the last 2 lines of that stanza. It's almost like a math problem, for heaven's sake. But this is an awfully good villanelle. I'm proud of you.
Thank you. It's also got a rhyme scheme. So
yes.
Line 1 has to rhyme with line A, and line 2 has to rhyme with line 5 and 7, and etc.
Good. Have at it.
All right. And I was just lucky in that the quoted line, which is line 7, had stuck in my mind, but I didn't know where I read it. And then I was reading Bill Bryson's book about the body, and he gave the person that the quote came from. So I was able to attribute it. So line 7 is a quote by Peter Medawar, who is a Nobel Prize winner. Quarantine villanelle. I'm stuck at home in quarantine, or is it merely social isolation? I'm making sure my hands are clean. I should be eating lean cuisine and practicing caloric deprivation. I'm stuck at home in quarantine. This virus, bad news wrapped in a protein, I fear it will transform a new mutation. So please make sure your hands are clean. I should begin an exercise routine instead of using wine as lubrication. I'm stuck at home in quarantine. I could be riding in a limousine in Paris on a luxury vacation. Instead, I'm washing hands so clean. One day, perhaps there'll be a new vaccine or doctors will discover mitigation. Till then, I'm here in quarantine, nothing to do but keep my hands clean.
Gorgeous.
Thank you.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you.
It wins the Nobel Prize for villanelles. That's a great line that you found there. This virus, bad news wrapped in a protein.
And just to be autobiographical, so this summer is my husband's and my 45th wedding anniversary, and I had rented an apartment in Paris.
Oh.
Quel dommage.
Oh, yeah.
We'll be stuck at home in quarantine.
I want to finish off this conversation and ask both of you to look ahead into the future. I'm older than the two of you, but we're all at an age when we can speak freely. How do you see the future? Obviously, it's going to have vast economic repercussions, and this will be unjust, and it will fall heavily on the most innocent people. But how do you see life in the future in America? People talk about getting back to normal. Will there ever be a return to normal? Or are we now being changed, you and I, without our being aware of it? Question mark.
Well, I'm sure we are being changed. And I'm only a few years younger than you are. I'm really not seeing a future. And it will be a very different future. My daughter and I made up a fantasy. One fantasy is that the whole family will be at the beach, sitting on a blanket next to other people. Another fantasy is that we'll be at a ball game, having a beer and a hot dog. But I don't think we'll return to things like that in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And, as the mother of a severely disabled child who was in a group home, who did have a job, who was studying karate, who did sing in a choir, he's lost all of those things. He's back home with us, and I can't see that it's safe to send him back out. Mm-hmm. And I'm very concerned about his future, where he needs to have someone take care of him. And who will that be? Mm-hmm. I can't answer that.
Yeah, no. Jeff.
Well, I wish I could give a more optimistic view, but I don't think I can. I do feel like things are going to change. We're not going to be back the way that we used to be just at the beginning of this year. In the foreseeable future, let's say, next few years anyway. And I think a lot's going to be lost as a result of that. But if there's anything optimistic, I would say it's that, we as humans are quite resilient and inventive. And I think if we're given the opportunity to express that, we may yet evolve into a normal that is people find just as good as what we left behind. The problem I think that I have is that there's two streams of what's making us not normal. There's the pandemic stream, which happens to overlap with just the terrible partisanship and divisions in our country that, have nothing to do with that, but yet kind of overlap into it. And that too, could, depending on what happens at the end of this year with our election, I think we're facing two very different futures. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a double complexity here that I think makes it very difficult for anybody to say where things are going to be. You can't pick up anything that you read, without there being some prognosticator, somebody who's got some announcement that's going to be this way or that way, that we're never going to do this, or we're always going to do that, or air travel is going to be, none of it till next year, or shopping is going to be this way. And I just don't think anybody knows right now. Right. So maybe that's a good reason for optimism too, is that, nobody knows. So in the absence of that gives us some room to hope for the best.
And in one area for optimism have been the pictures that we've seen on Facebook of, you can see the Himalayas now in India, you can, the clearing up of pollution in cities. Humans have not done good things to the earth recently. And so perhaps the need for addressing climate change will coalesce with this, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. When people ask me how I'm doing, I look them in the eye and I say, social isolation is the life that every writer has been looking for forever. Mm-hmm. And so this is the ideal. Mm-hmm. And people laugh. People laugh. I'm not sure if I mean it or not, but I do feel a love for this very simple, day in, day out. Every day is roughly the same as every other day, except tonight I had the chance to talk to you. I think that we're heading towards something that's simpler, and
that's good. Yeah.
And in which our close relationships to other people, including the ones in our own family, that during times of great busyness and ambition, we have tended to ignore, that this may come to be the big element, the most important thing in our lives. And if that is true, I think there's an enormous future for poetry.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Well, I thank you both for joining me. It was fun talking to poets and seeing you up close.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're not how we imagined you would look. I thought Jeff's hair was going to be longer. And,
well, it's longer than it used. It's longer than it should be. I was going to admire your haircut, so I understand that your wife gave you one, and I'm not letting my wife come close to mine. So
please, have faith. Thank you both.
My wife.
Thank you, Jeff Coomer.
Sure.
Thank you, Barbara Crooker.
Thank you, Garrison.
Take care. Be well.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.